When you look at the bigger picture, compared with the last few days, low pressure sitting to the west and various weather fronts coming up from the south-southwest along with very mild air. We've seen rain progress north across the UK. Shetland still clinging on to that rain until late evening. Showers follow for western Scotland, Northern Ireland, a brisk breeze here, lighter winds elsewhere and clear spells for a time, but a thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain will return by the end of the night into southern England and South Wales. 12 to 13 Celsius in the south. I think under any clear spells for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, 4 to 7 Celsius, and a bright start here first thing this weekend. However, the rain in the south is moving north, and by late morning it reaches Northern Ireland, it reaches southern Scotland. It does clear from the south for a time, but further spells of rain or showers will affect Wales and the southwest. Meanwhile, the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast sees sunshine returning and an awful lot of warmth, 22 or 23 Celsius here, high teens elsewhere, although feeling a bit fresher there for Scotland as well as Northern England, especially under the outbreaks of rain, which will push north during Saturday evening, clearing away once again during the early hours of Sunday, and then further showers arrive later in the night across western parts of the UK, along with a keen breeze. Another mild night to come, temperatures fairly widely staying in the teens. Then we begin Sunday with some brightness, some sunshine across central and eastern parts of the UK, cloudier skies further west, showers arriving from the west as the day progresses, along with that keen breeze. And then Monday sees the cloud thickening after a bright start, further wind and rain turning up later.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank and, of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
It's 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, your afternoon fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis. I'm Arlene Foster and here's what's coming up over the next hour. Northern Ireland, it seems, is heading for a new Assembly election as the deadline to restore devolved government at Stormont set up by the Northern Ireland Secretary was missed. I'll be joined by Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, leader of the DUP. We will look back at Rishi Sunak's first week as Prime Minister, his newly appointed cabinet, his first PMQs and Home Secretary reappointment. Are we looking at a serious government? And the online safety bill has been postponed once again due to the change of Prime Minister. But how does this new delay affect children's safety online? Plus, we'll be having a look at our exclusive Life and Times interview with former Home Secretary Amber Rudd. Gloria Di Piero sat down with the former Home Secretary She branded the Rwanda deportation policy as brutal, but she said that Zoella Braverman deserves a chance in post. Also, I want to hear from you. Give me your political briefing. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. But first, here's the news with Alice.
Good afternoon. It's just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. A snap election in Northern Ireland is looming after the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan shortly. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Peter Carl, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, says over the last 6 months there hasn't been enough focus on providing stability in Stormont.
Things have got quite dysfunctional because, unfortunately, in the 6 months that we have had since the last set of elections, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, 3 Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland and no negotiations or progress on the protocol. So all of the fundamentals that underpin peace, prosperity and progress in Northern Ireland just haven't been there. And also a crucial relationship that we don't talk enough about is the relationship between the Irish government and the UK government, which has reached an all-time low in recent months.
A man has been convicted in Bristol of murdering his former partner, who died 21 years after he doused her with petrol and set her on fire. Stephen Craig targeted Jacqueline Kirk in a car park in Weston-super-Mare in 1998. She suffered burns to 35% of her body. Craig was convicted of grievous bodily harm with intent, but was arrested again last year following Miss Kirk's death. During the trial, medical experts explained how Craig's actions 21 years ago had made a more than minimal contribution to her death due to the long-lasting impact of the burns. A woman has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 34 years for killing her friend and decapitating the body. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell has become the first woman to be sentenced on TV in England. The woman was found guilty of murdering Mi Kun Chong at her London home in June last year and then driving her body in a suitcase to Devon. The judge's sentencing was broadcast live from the Old Bailey in London.
There is the chilling aspect of what you did to and with her body after you had killed her. You have shown absolutely no remorse, and it appears that you are in complete denial as to what you did, notwithstanding what, in my judgment, amounted to overwhelming evidence against you.
The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members of his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focusing on what he called domestic challenges. He's also backing down on a pledge to fine patients £10 if they miss GP and hospital appointments.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that, I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Meanwhile, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says not showing up to the climate conference shows a failure in leadership.
Prime Minister should be going to COP. He needs to show leadership. This is a hugely important issue, climate change. It's wound together with the energy crisis, and I think many people would be expecting the Prime Minister of the UK not just to attend COP, but to use it as an opportunity to pull world leaders together to deal with climate and to deal with energy. And if that doesn't happen, it's a failure of leadership.
A British gas-owned firm says it's reopened for the coming winter, increasing the country's gas storage capacity by 50%. Centrica says it's brought the Rough gas storage facility, which closed in 2017. Secretary of State for Business Grant Shapps tweeted saying that the reopening is brilliant news, adding the move will strengthen UK energy security. The husband of the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been violently assaulted after a break-in at the couple's California home earlier today. A statement from her office says the assailant is in custody and the motivation for the attack is under investigation. Paul Pelosi was taken to hospital and is expected to make a full recovery. His wife was not in San Francisco at the time. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to the briefing with Arlene Foster.
Welcome back to the briefing. And the top story of the day is, of course, the deadlock in Northern Ireland over the damage caused by the Northern Ireland Protocol. Unionists across the region are united in their opposition to the protocol, and yet the government, the Conservative and Unionist Party government, continue to tread water. Well, I'm delighted to say that we're now joined by Sir Jeffrey Donaldson. He's the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. Thanks so much, Jeffrey, for joining us today. I know it's a very busy day for you today. Yesterday, you were under attack from all sides. Explain to the viewers and listeners why it's important for you to try and get this protocol sorted out.
Well, good afternoon, Arlene. Greetings from Portadown in the heart of Northern Ireland. As you can see, I'm on the move this afternoon. Yes, clearly this is a very critical time for Northern Ireland. The Unionist position is very clear. The Northern Ireland Protocol creates a barrier to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, so the goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland are subject to checks. And indeed, in the case of steel products that are being purchased by Northern Ireland companies from businesses in Great Britain are subject to 25% tariffs. So we have the ridiculous situation where the cost of building hospitals and schools and houses and roads in Northern Ireland is being driven through the roof by these tariffs imposed by the European Union, even though those steel products are coming from another part of the United Kingdom. So the protocol is harming our economy, harming households. It's driving up the cost of living. Food is more expensive in Northern Ireland because the cost of transporting food from Great Britain has gone up due to the protocol. That's why we want the protocol sorted out. And in the absence of unionist support for that protocol, the consensus does not exist on a cross-community basis to restore the political institutions, for the reason that unionist ministers would have to implement a protocol that is harming Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
And so the Belfast Agreement is the basis of the Northern Ireland Assembly. It's been in place now for nearly 25 years. It's very clear on the position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom until such times as the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise. So were you taken aback by the fact that Sinn Féin, the SDLP, the Alliance Party and indeed the Irish government are all indicating that if we have to go back, leave devolution and go back to direct rule, it will be some form of joint authority? Surely that's contrary to the Belfast Agreement.
Well, it absolutely is. The Belfast Agreement makes clear that Northern Ireland remains an integral part of the United Kingdom, and all parties to that agreement respect that outcome. Joint authority would disrespect the Good Friday Agreement. It would disrespect our constitutional place within the United Kingdom and would be totally unacceptable to unionists. And I think it's time for Dublin and for the other parties to dial down the rhetoric and join with us in finding a solution that enables the political institutions here to be restored as soon as possible.
So I take it from that, Jeffrey, that you still believe in devolution and you still want devolution to happen in Northern Ireland. But we're going to have an election by the looks of it. We'll hear, hopefully, from the Secretary of State during this programme this afternoon. But isn't it the case that an election's not going to really change anything? In fact, Bertie Ahern, who you and I know very well, former Irish Prime Minister, said today, an election won't change a damn thing. What's the point of this election? Oh dear, we seem to have lost Jeffrey. I'm really sorry about that. He was in a car in Portadown, but I'm delighted to say that I am joined by Olivia Otley, who's our political correspondent here on GB News. You heard Sir Jeffrey there saying that they had no option but to not form an executive. It looks as if the Secretary of State is going to speak to us later on this afternoon. It seems that an election is inevitable, isn't it?
It does seem like an election's inevitable, but as you mentioned there, it's hard to see what this election is going to solve. The DUP is very concerned about the protocol because, as Jeffrey mentioned there, of course, the burden it puts on Northern Irish businesses, the economic burden, but also more generally the principle of the thing.
Sure.
Obviously, the unionists feel that the Northern Ireland Protocol just rides roughshod over the whole principle of consent, which underpins the Good Friday Agreement, because if everything that's being talked about in Stormont is through the lens of the protocol, then there is no real way that the DUP or any unionist can have a meaningful say over what's happening. So in what way can that be said to be contingent with the Good Friday Agreement? So you have this election, but without meaningful movement on the protocol, it's hard to see what will happen. And we know that Sinn Féin will treat, as they did in May, this election as a sort of border poll, although what they did in May was barely mention the prospect of a united Ireland. During the campaign, they wanted to be seen as a sort of progressive party, a progressive left-wing party that could get the youth on side without appearing too partisan. And then, of course, when the election happens, it does become a border poll issue. So it feels as though the prospect of an election could just entrench the divisions which we're already seeing.
Well, I think we have Jeffrey back on the line again. Jeffrey, I was essentially just saying that Bertie Ahern had said the election isn't going to change a damn thing. I presume you would agree with that, would you? Oh dear, we don't seem to have sound for Sir Jeffrey at the moment. We seem to be struggling with Jeffrey, but we're going to come back to Olivia, because the Secretary of State is under a duty in the legislation to call an election. But of course, Parliament is supreme. He doesn't necessarily have to call an election. He could go to Parliament and say, we're going to give some time for talks. Do you think he's going to call an election, however?
It seems as though, it feels at this point as though it's pretty inevitable that he's going to call an election. I've seen that there are some big unionist thinkers who aren't happy about that. There was an interesting piece in the Telegraph today by Kate Hoey saying that the Parliament didn't call an election when it was Sinn Féin who was saying that they wouldn't reform a government. So there's definitely some anger there, and I think there is a general feeling, in fact, on both sides, that it's quite possible that an election will just entrench divisions more and not solve anything. But, I mean, don't like making predictions when something's... the press conference is just about to happen, apparently, but it does feel at this stage as though it's all but
Well, I mean,
inevitable.
he was very clear on the run-up, and whether that was just him trying to pressurise the Democratic Unionist Party, although if he had known anything about Northern Ireland, he would have known that that wasn't going to work. But he did say that he would call an election. So with Northern Ireland heading to the polls after it appears that there hasn't been agreement to come together to elect a new speaker, the anger isn't just at the protocol, it isn't just limited to the Assembly, it's also affecting businesses right across Northern Ireland. And our Northern Ireland reporter, Dougie Beattie, has been out and about to hear a little bit more about that.
Elections with no governments is nothing new in Northern Ireland. The last one in 2017 saw Sinn Féin stay out for 1,044 days. This time, it's the DUP that are refusing to enter. They are protesting over the European Brexit agreement called the Protocol. None of the Unionist parties support it because it puts a border down the Irish Sea and annexes the commercial side of Northern Ireland. It's not just politicians that oppose it. Those in road haulage, such as Peter Somerton, say that the paperwork is worthless, and if implemented in full, the supply chains into Northern Ireland will stop within 48 hours.
I'll start with the value of the paperwork. The value of the paperwork is zero. And it's zero because these are all goods that are in free circulation throughout the rest of the UK. The cost of it, using the government's own numbers, for the Trailer Support Service alone was 340 million. That's for 2.3 million declarations, £150 for each movement between GB and Northern Ireland Extra. Add to that, if they're SPS goods, the cost of health certification, which is about £150. the costs just become astronomical. That's why the government knows and the EU knows they cannot deploy the Northern Ireland Protocol. If the protocol was to be deployed as it's written at any point in time from the 1st of April 21, when it should have been, according to the law, then the supply chain for frozen and fresh goods into Northern Ireland would have, and I'll agree with one of my industry colleagues from last week, would last no more than 48 hours.
The cost of living crisis is already stretching budgets, and with less goods coming into Northern Ireland, costs are rising.
It's not hard to model this out. In fact, we can see it every day, because whenever we're moving goods from Britain to the Republic of Ireland, we can see an extension of the time delay in those goods that used to move day 1, delivery day 3, to now day 1 for delivery day 8. Now that just doesn't work whenever you bring it to the additional complexity of a fully integrated supply chain like exists between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The government knows this, the Commission knows this. It's time that we're actually saying the emperor's no clothes, this doesn't work.
Belfast Port has always dealt with containers from right around the globe. But those from GB mainland are taken to one side, inspected by EU officials, and then told if they can enter the market and what tariffs must be put upon them.
There isn't anywhere else where third countries move the type of goods on the flows that move between Britain and Northern Ireland entering the EU. That just doesn't work like that. That's not how international trade works. It's a container load of beef with one cert moving across a deep water port, getting checked on a period of days into Rotterdam, into Calais, and then getting released into free circulation at the very start of the food process. What we have here is at the end of the process, instead we have got tens and tens and tens of commodities all in the same truck, all moving across the RIC together. One fault on any one of these issues, and I have some examples in front of me. For example, I have an example here where on the same health cert, one product was rejected. So everything that was on the trailer actually went back to Britain. I have an example where the wrong shape of a letter I resulted in product being sent back.
A new election will not bring new results. The same two parties will be back in whatever order, and the more liberal will be squeezed, and the problems with the protocol will still remain. Dougie Beattie, GB News.
Thanks to Dougie Beattie there. Well, coming up, I'll be talking to the esteemed political historian Sir Anthony Selden about Rishi Sunak's first week as Prime Minister and the challenges he has ahead. But before that, let's take a look at the weather.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern. Welcome along to the latest weather update from the Met Office. Rain for some of us during the rest of the day, mainly northern Scotland, but drier for many after the rain has cleared through. But it stays breezy. Similar setup when you look at the bigger picture compared with the last few days. Low pressure sitting to the west and various weather fronts coming up from the south-southwest along with very mild air. We've seen rain progress north across the UK. Shetland still clinging on to that rain until late evening. Showers follow for western Scotland, Northern Ireland. A brisk breeze here, lighter winds elsewhere and clear spells for a time, but a thicker cloud and outbreaks of rain will return by the end of the night into southern England and South Wales. 12 to 13 Celsius in the south. I think under any clear spells for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, 4 to 7 Celsius, and a bright start here first thing this weekend. However, the rain in the south is moving north, and by late morning it reaches Northern Ireland, it reaches southern Scotland. It does clear from the south for a time, but further spells of rain or showers will affect Wales and the southwest. Meanwhile, the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast sees sunshine returning and an awful lot of warmth, 22 or 23 Celsius here, high teens elsewhere, although feeling a bit fresher there for Scotland as well as Northern England, especially under the outbreaks of rain, which will push north during Saturday evening, clearing away once again during the early hours of Sunday, and then further showers arrive later in the night across western parts of the UK, along with a keen breeze. Another mild night to come, temperatures fairly widely staying in the teens. Then we begin Sunday with some brightness, some sunshine across central and eastern parts of the UK, cloudier skies further west, showers arriving from the west as the day progresses, along with that keen breeze. And then Monday sees the cloud thickening after a bright start, further wind and rain turning up later.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
Welcome back. Well, this week, Rishi Sunak has become the United Kingdom's 57th Prime Minister. He comes into office during a time of economic uncertainty and war once again on the European continent. This week, the Prime Minister has appointed his cabinet, including a Chancellor brought in by his predecessor and restored a Home Secretary who had resigned only 6 days previously. Michael Gove, Oliver Dowden and Dominic Raab also return to senior roles. The immediate priority is the economy, yet the autumn statement has now been pushed back to the 17th of November. Well, joining me now to discuss the immediate priorities for the Prime Minister is the political historian and biographer Sir Anthony Selden, author of The Path of Peace, Walking the Western Front Way. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I suppose really what you've been a keen observer of politics and politicians. What do you think about Rishi's style? What's going to be different now that we have this new Prime Minister?
Well, he'll be different to Liz Truss, but that's not very difficult to be different to Liz Truss. And he will also be different to Boris Johnson. He'll be a much more considered figure, where Boris Johnson was wild and unpredictable and made a virtue of making it up on the hoof, and where Liz Truss, rightly or wrongly, was very bold and very emphatic and very quick in what she did. Rishi Sunak is going to be much more considered, much more measured, far more aware of the impact of what he says on the markets and on volatile economic opinion at home and abroad. So he's somebody who understands money, understands the markets, understands the economy, understands business needs. I think a bigger question, Arlene, is does he understand anything much beyond those things?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see him this week coming out so strongly for a modernised education system.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting call as well, echoing really what the King had been saying about vocational training in certain parts. I suppose I want to know, Anthony, whether you think he's got what Kipling would call the common touch. Is he going to be... I mean, you've said that Boris made it up on the hoof, and he was certainly someone who wasn't your usual politician. But does Rishi have that common touch, and is he able to appeal to people in the way that Boris certainly was?
Well, we'll have to see, won't we? As you know very well, it's only once you get inside number 10 that we see quite what somebody is made of. Nothing not being a foreign secretary or home secretary or defence secretary or any other position, leader of the opposition, prepares you for what it's like to be prime minister. So we don't know yet is the simple answer. But looking at his track record, as Chancellor, and some Chancellors have gone on to be very good Prime Ministers, and others, like Gordon Brown, have found it full of woe and difficulty. But he did show, didn't he, during the pandemic, with the Eat Out scheme and with the furlough scheme, both of which were very much Rishi Sunak's rather than Boris Johnson's, that he does have that common touch, Arlene, that he is able to understand how people are feeling. Very rich, though Rishi Sunak is himself, that doesn't preclude him having that common feeling. No reason why it should preclude you having that common feeling if you are able to be sensitive enough and in touch enough. And I would think it looks promising that he might well expand. To be a Prime Minister is a job of the heart as well as just the head.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely the point. And I'm just interested, finally, Anthony, to know what your take is on his call not to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, not to go to COP27, but instead stay at home and to deal with the domestic issues in front of him. What do you make of that?
It's difficult to know what to make of it. Is he making a political statement there about the fact he's not going to let net zero and all the other COP26 Glasgow imperatives dominate? Maybe. And certainly he wasn't overly, as Chancellor, overly involved and pushing the green agenda, although he was very keen on the boost to the green economy. Or on the other hand, is it simply, and understandably, he's become Prime Minister this week. He does have rather a lot on his plate, and he thinks that the business of losing 48, 72 hours abroad with all the difficulties of time zones and jet lag, that it would be more sensible for him to follow it all from home, to make his interventions from home. I don't think we know yet, but we will see whether he's going to be like Boris Johnson. One of his signature strengths and enthusiasms was the green economy, green energy, wind farms, the boost to the economy and net zero. Is he going to follow on in that direction, or is he going to be more like Liz Truss, where she's putting the other needs first? We'll see.
Anthony, so thank you so much for joining me. It's been fascinating to speak with you, as always. I'm just going to turn to Olivia very quickly and ask you, Olivia, on that final point on the green agenda. Is he going to be more Liz or more Boris?
Well, it's very hard to see because, as Anthony alluded to there, we don't really know much yet of what Sunak Toryism looks like. And I think that's a bit of a problem that he's got now. At the moment, it feels as though he's managed to be kind of all things to all people. To those on the Truss side wing of the party, the small state, low taxes, he's a sort of sensible, Thatcherite fiscal conservative who will balance the books and enact a pro-growth agenda. But then to those on the further to the left of the party, or the more socially conservatives and those on the left, He's the Chancellor of furlough. He's the Chancellor of Eat Out to Help Out. He's the Chancellor who said, I'm prepared to bring the full might of the state down to help those who are most in need of help. And I think that's the problem. We don't yet know. And on the green agenda, that's huge, because those on the right of the party would want Sunak to not be, propping up clean energy companies. It would want it to let the market do its job. Whereas those on the left of the party tend to be keener on making sure that we hit all our international pledges and pumping lots and lots of money into the green agenda. So he's going to have a decision to make here. And I think it is quite interesting that he's chosen not to go to Egypt to this COP27. I think that, yes, I mean, he's an incredibly busy man, and I don't think it would be a particularly good look to have him swanning off to Egypt to attend a nice jamboree. But I think it does give a bit of an indication. I think he might be going towards the sort of less net zero focused, more make sure people are okay here at home this very difficult winter approach.
Well, it'll be very interesting to watch over the next coming weeks what his take is on the green agenda. But coming up, GB News presenter Gloria De Piero has an exclusive interview with former Home Secretary Amber Rudd. We'll hear her views on the reappointment of Zoella Braverman to the role and her views on the government's Rwanda policy. That's just in a few minutes. But first, here's your news headlines.
It's 3:33. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. A snap election in Northern Ireland is looming after the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan imminently. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Party leader of the DUP, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, says the protocol is harming the economy.
We have the ridiculous situation where the cost of building hospitals and schools and houses and roads in Northern Ireland is being driven through the roof by these tariffs imposed by the European Union, even though those steel products are coming from another part of the United Kingdom. So the protocol is harming our economy, harming households. It's driving up the cost of living. Food is more expensive in Northern Ireland because the cost of transporting food from Great Britain has gone up due to the protocol. That's why we want the protocol sorted out.
The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members from his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focusing on domestic issues.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that. I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
The husband of the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been violently assaulted after a break-in at the couple's California home earlier today. A statement from her office says the assailant is in custody and the motivation for the attack is under investigation. Paul Pelosi was taken to hospital and is expected to make a full recovery. His wife was not in San Francisco at the time. TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Arlene Foster.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
Welcome back to the briefing. Well, the online safety bill has been delayed again. The legislation was meant to be brought back next week, but with the change of Prime Minister, there's currently no date for when it will return to the House of Commons. Internet safety groups say the government's decision puts children at risk. Well, I'm joined now by Richard Collard, who's the Child Safety Online Policy and Regulatory Manager at the NSPCC. Richard's been doing a lot of work with parents about how they can give advice to their children. And thank you, Richard, for joining us today. Obviously, you're probably very concerned about the delay in this piece of legislation.
It's incredibly frustrating. I mean, first and foremost, this is fundamentally a piece of child safety legislation. And if we think about the backdrop that this delay comes off of, we've seen in the last 4 weeks a coroner conclude that technology platforms directly contributed to the death of a child. We've seen record number of grooming offences. We're seeing record number of child abuse image offences happening in the UK. And this bill is designed to tackle this. We need to make sure that we pass the online safety bill as soon as possible, because the people that are being truly harmed by this are children. These are real life children, and we need to make sure that this bill can effectively go through Parliament so these children can stay safe.
And Richard, as I was saying in the introduction, you spend a lot of your time giving advice to parents around online safety. And I was reading a little bit on this, that during the pandemic, you've seen a rise in online grooming. Do you want to tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the pandemic really created a perfect storm of both children spending more time online, perpetrators of abuse spending more time online, and the embodiment of more risky design features, live streaming, children spending more time on some problematic platforms. And this has led to an increase in abuse. But the problem is that although the pandemic's ended, this rise in grooming has not stopped. And we need to make sure that technology companies, where a lot of this abuse takes place, this abuse takes place on private messaging, it happens on social media. We need to make sure that these social media platforms are obligated to protect children. They put in place barriers to stop adults reaching out to children, to stop grooming happening. And that's, again, why we need this bill, because at the moment, these technology platforms are able just to do as they please. It's a wild west web out there.
Richard, thank you so much. I just want to ask Olivia Otley, who's been with me all afternoon, around the fact that there is a bit of tension here between free speech and child protection. Of course, child protection is critical when you listen to Richard talking about what's been happening during the pandemic. But free speech, a lot of the Conservative MPs are concerned about that as well.
Well, absolutely. There are Conservative MPs, civil liberty campaigners like David Davis, who's very concerned about this bill, who feel as though it was a well-intentioned piece of legislation intended to help children stay safe online, but it's morphed into something quite different, which could mean that the state becomes the enforcer of what is and what isn't allowed online.
Yeah.
And
it's this legal but harmful piece, isn't that right?
Legal but harmful,
yeah.
which is the key part of the legislation. And you can imagine how, you know, you'd hope that politicians would interpret that in a sort of sensible way, but it leaves the door open legally for a Prime Minister one day to say, no, I find this content harmful, I don't like it, I disagree with it politically, therefore I'll ban it. I mean, that's an extreme example, but the idea of a law which could make political opinion unacceptable, illegal online is pretty worrying to a lot of civil liberties campaigners. So it's not really surprising that we're seeing with the new Prime Minister, who we know is quite a cautious man, he does things steadily, he looks at all the evidence, he'll be reviewing that quite carefully to see where that sort of sweet point balance can be found.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll be returning to this during the programme. It's something we've been watching out for quite some time in relation to the child protection aspect as well. But this week, we did see Rishi Sunak put in as new Prime Minister, but pressure is mounting on him for the reappointment of Zoella Braverman as Home Secretary. Gloria Di Piero sat down with the former Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. She branded the Rwanda deportation policy as brutal, but that Braverman deserves a chance in the post. They also had time to reminisce about her famous quote that Boris is not the man you want to drive you home at the end of the night. And now being Home Secretary is a tough job. This is the life and times.
Amber Rudd, so pleased to see you.
Great to see you too, Gloria.
Because your party has been through one heck of a couple of months. What have you made of it, having been such a big figure in your party until 2019, just watching on telly like the rest of us?
It's been like watching a horror movie, really. I find myself absolutely gripped. So sometimes I think I'm over it, I'm beyond politics, I've moved on to other things, but I've just got to check on Twitter what the latest drama is. So I've been watching through my fingers the dramas, the ups, the downs of the past 3 or 4 months. It's been very upsetting, and I am, I think, relieved, happy that we now have what I hope will be a more stable government.
I remember during the referendum debates, and you were a leading Remainer, the government, the David Cameron government's position was to remain, of course. Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, others took a different view. And I always remember seeing you and listening to you saying to Boris Johnson, you were colleagues at the time, you wouldn't want Boris Johnson. He's not the man you want driving you home at the end of the evening.
Yes, I think that might have been my finest moment in politics. I still have people coming up to me because, Gloria, you haven't given the whole line. The whole line is Boris Johnson is the life and soul of the party, but not the man you want to drive you home at the end of the evening. And there was a sort of sharp intake of breath when I said this. I realised as I said it, a few people were going to call it a little bit inappropriate, but it really landed. Plenty of people agreed with me.
What did you mean by that?
I like to think I meant something much more innocent that was interpreted, but it was interpreted with such vigour, I just decided to nod and sit back from it. But it was an incredible debate, and when I was asked to do it, it was by far the biggest thing I'd done. It was a huge responsibility, and in politics I always think, and I say this to young men and women who ask me advice about getting on in politics, you have to get noticed, you have to be bold, and you have to take risks with your own ability, your own status. And so when I was asked to do the debate, to represent Remain, I accepted it, thinking at the same time, oh, how am I going to do this? How am I going to pull this off? And they took us for all sorts of training. We had Alistair Campbell advising me how to attack the Conservatives opposite me, which was a worrying proposition. Nicola Sturgeon, who was on our team, didn't come to the preparation. She sent a stand-in, which should have really been a sign that I'm not sure she was wholly committed to the cause. But overall, we thought we did rather well. But the Leave campaign, of course, did better. And they just kept on repeating their lines again and again and again. And I could see that Boris, who had 2 women either side of him, had been told not to interrupt, to let other people speak. And despite himself, he managed to do that. So even though I thought we put up a good case, they did too.
Was he cross with you afterwards? Did he joke with you about it? Did he say, Amber, that was below the belt?
It was, no, he wasn't cross with me, but you know what it's like when you're doing live television. You might have, if you're lucky, a minute in a break to get a comfort break. And we had 90 seconds for a comfort break. And we all ran out and had to run back again, obviously, in time. And he just shouted at me as we went, ready to surrender, Amber? As though he'd won and we'd lost. But I said, absolutely not, ready to fight on. He never got offended at anything I said, and all thought it was part of the cut and thrust.
You must have sat with Liz Truss in Cabinet. You obviously sat with Liz Truss in Cabinet. Were you friends?
Yeah, we were friends. She came to my 50th birthday. I went to her 40th. Her 40th lasted later into the night than my 50th. We were friends, and we got on pretty well, really. In fact, I was looking at my old file of cabinet photos the other day. First cabinet I was in 2015, she was in as well. We're both sort of somewhere at the back row in the power play of junior cabinet roles. And then now, well, at least not now, but a week ago, when Liz Truss was at the centre of her own cabinet as Prime Minister, I reflected that she was the only person from the cabinet 7 years ago that was in the current cabinet up till last week. I mean, politicians' lives are short.
You were Home Secretary, one of the great officers of state. We were in the same intake. I sat on the opposition benches for all that time.
Yes.
Watched your meteoric rise. The migrant crisis, the small boats crisis, I don't remember that being a thing.
No, I mean, there were plenty of immigration issues that really were important when I was in the Home Office and difficult to deal with. But the so-called small boats crisis was not. I think in 2018 we had, in fact, I checked this because of the recent figures, we had 300 approximately come across in the whole year. And now it seems to be that per day. It's extraordinary the way it's changed.
Why? Because we keep hearing successive Conservative Home Secretaries saying they will deal with this, they will sort it out. Is it possible to sort it out?
It's very difficult to sort it out. And the fact is there are always going to be, I think, a lot of people who want to come through France and into the UK because UK is a great country, a lot of their family are here, they speak the language. There are compelling reasons to come to the UK, but it is a dangerous crossing. And as people keep on doing it and succeeding, the smugglers and the people traffickers keep on saying, look, this is working, let's do more of it. I think part of the reason that it's happened on this scale is because it's become more difficult to travel by lorry because actually the detection on the lorries has been so good. And then, of course, they didn't come during COVID. And generally, the view was that the channel was too dangerous for people to come across in small boats. And that held until people started doing it and realised they could. But the only answer, I think, and this is what I would advise anybody who's trying to actually address it, is to have a good relationship with the French. And if you have a
We could give them lots of money.
We do give them lots of money, and you have to, because we're trying to patrol borders, which are effectively shared borders between them and us in northern France. And it's right that we do try and do that. It's pretty irritating for the French, because they've got a lot of people camped there, and they are willing to help these people, put them into homes, give them, support, but they don't want it. They just want to be there, waiting for the opportunity to get across to the UK. But the only way we can stop that is by having a better relationship with the French to patrol it, but also to have a better story about it. Because also in my last year, we were returning some people to Europe, to France, when they arrived, because we could say that under the Dublin arrangements, we could legitimately return people to another European country if they'd come there first. Now there's none of that. People who get here, no, they're not going to be returned to another European country. So the government has proposed this idea instead of sending people to Rwanda. I don't believe in it. For the start, I think it is a brutal policy, which we should not have introduced anyway, but it is also, putting that aside, impractical. I just don't believe it will ever happen. So I think there's a real problem with the growing numbers of people putting their lives in danger. In a way, it's a shared problem with the French, and I hope that this new government is going to address it by having a better relationship with the French. I mean, let's face it, it can only improve.
Rishi Sunak says he's committed to the Rwanda policy. Obviously, he's brought Zoella Braverman, who I might ask you about a question about in a second, as Home Secretary, who is fervently, she dreams of sending people to Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to say. She should dream of having a safer policy, which certainly she's entitled to dream about having borders where you don't have lots of people arriving across a dangerous passage like the Channel, but not perhaps to put it quite in those terms that she has. I think it's difficult politically for the Conservative Party to step back from a policy they've proposed and have said is the answer, but I question whether people think it can really have any impact or is actually going to take place. The only way to try to improve on the situation is to have a better relationship with the French and with the EU. The whole issue of immigration and refugees is not a situation just for the UK. It has to be taken as part of a international policy, but particularly with the EU.
Were you surprised to see Zoella Braverman, who resigned a matter of days ago over a breach of the ministerial code, brought back days later?
I was surprised, but to be fair, she hasn't really had much chance to be Home Secretary. It's an incredibly difficult job. I think there are very few politicians who wake up in the morning and think, you know what I really want to do? I want to be Home Secretary. It's not a job that people usually really want to do because it is incredibly hard. When I say hard, it's not just difficult to get right, like we've been discussing on immigration. You're also dealing with some of the worst of humanity, the things you have to try and see and help people with. And when you discuss issues like child sex abuse or violent crime, these are things that are disturbing and difficult, and your job as Home Secretary is to try to help form policy and support the people dealing with it. So let's give her a chance and see how it goes.
So you were Home Secretary. You had to resign when you were Home Secretary. What is the emotional and psychological impact of resigning from a great office of state?
I think I always find that question quite difficult because I don't want to draw attention to any difficulty I felt, because I resigned over something which I think was a great sin, really, committed against a large number of people by the country, by the state. And the fact that it was difficult for me and my family is as nothing, really, compared to the terrible difficulties and wrongs that were committed to people of the Windrush generation, who are the people who were really badly treated by a whole series of Home Secretaries and Prime Ministers who quite simply were unable to regularise what should have been perfectly simple situation, which is people who arrived at a certain period of time, largely from Caribbean countries, should have been given their papers so they were accepted as British citizens. And over quite a long period, it emerged that they hadn't been, and they were treated appallingly. So, but to answer your question, of course it was upsetting for me, but I was genuinely more, I think I'm trying to be honest about this here because I got nothing to lose on it. I think I was generally more appalled and upset on behalf of the people, some of whom I saw and talked to, who had had their lives so terribly disrupted by this horrific behaviour from the state.
It's very noble of you.
Yeah,
no, it is. I mean, genuinely, it's sincerely held.
I think if I was still a politician, one could cynically say that's too noble. That sounds ridiculous. But since I'm no longer a politician and I do reflect on it, it does shock me that these terrible things were done to so many people.
You have a daughter, very outspoken, very clever, Flora. Would you ever recommend to your daughter or somebody you loved, a woman, to go into politics?
I try to. I really do, because like you, I hope, Gloria, we know the value of it and the potential for doing good and real things. But I go around quite a lot of schools and colleges still as part of the fun I have, really, about being an ex-politician. And a lot of the women look at me and they think I'm absolutely mad. They might have made the mistake of looking at my Twitter feeds and they go, how can you bear it? But then you have to tell them that there is such value in what you do, and I give them sort of examples of the good things that I think you can do, whether you're Conservative, whether you're Labour, even if you're Lib Dem. But my daughter has absolutely no intention of doing that. She's going to fight different battles, and good luck to her.
Did the abuse bother you? Did you get any abuse?
Yes. I got a lot of, even before I became Home Secretary, as I remember saying to one of your former colleagues, Chris Bryant, there's a lot of personal attacks on MPs and some people have had death threats. And he said to me, I don't know a single MP who hasn't had death threats. I mean, everybody has them. And in our time in politics, and just a little bit after, 2 MPs were killed. So there is reason why people are nervous of the life of an MP, but I still think it's a really valuable thing to do.
I think you're missed in public life.
Oh, that's very generous of you.
It's really nice to chat about your
you.
life and times and your recollections of that time in office. Thank you, Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Gloria.
A lovely interview there between 2 great female politicians. Well, you've been sending in some views on the deadlock in relation to Northern Ireland. Bill says, I think it is becoming more obvious in Northern Ireland that the Westminster government do not care about the Northern Irish citizens. They brought in the protocol and are refusing, it seems, to revoke it. Elizabeth says is it beyond the wit of so-called intelligent adults to find a solution to this problem, which works to the satisfaction of all parties? People are behaving like children and not adults when livelihoods are at stake. And finally, Alan says, what is apparent is that the government lacked the strength to tackle the difficult issues. On Northern Ireland, the protocol should have been dealt with months ago. Amen to that, I say. But you've been watching The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster. The show's back every Friday from 3 p.m. Up next, it's Nana Quia.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern. Welcome along to the latest weather update from the Met Office. Rain for some of us during the rest of the day, mainly northern Scotland, but drier for many after the rain has cleared through. But it stays breezy. Similar setup when you look at the bigger picture compared with the last few days. Low pressure sitting to the west and various weather fronts coming up from the south-southwest along with very mild air. We've seen rain progress north across the UK.